Assalamualaikum everybody and a very warm welcome on behalf of VLA Virtual Legal Advisory. Today we are going to discuss a very important topic, which is the relationship between the human rights framework and corporations, businesses all around the world. With us today we have an esteemed guest speaker, Shakeel A.Mian. Shakeel sir, thank you so much for joining us. Shakeel sir, before I take the audience through your background, I just quickly want to discuss the objectives of today's webinar. And we'll be talking about the relationship between businesses and human rights in connection with the United Nations Global Compact and Origins. Now, most people wouldn't know what the UN Global Compact is, where did it emerge from. We'll be looking at these points today. We'll be looking at the 10 principles under the UN Global Compact and the impact that these principles have had on corporations and organizations all around the world. So before we officially commence, I just want to explain a brief background about yourself. Shakeel Sab, you are a practicing lawyer and the managing partner at Prudential Middle East Legal Consultants. Your law firm is a participating member company for the United Nations Global Compact. And previously you worked for the British Legal Center as well as the World Justice Project. So would you like to add anything to this very glossy background of yours?
Yes. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me on this prestigious platform. I'm really thankful to you. And basically, I'm a practicing lawyer. I'm practicing law in UAE since 2008. And during the last 13 years in UAE, I had advised several local and international companies on matters relating to merger and acquisitions, legal due diligence to mitigate the investment risk for the investors, real estate matters, employment matters. I used to deliver lectures in University of Dubai on UAE employment and labor laws. I also advise several companies on matters relating to debt recoveries on a contingency basis. And of course, I also used to advise on matters relating to real estate and company incorporations as well as including drafting of various commercial contracts. I was also a former member of Dubai International Arbitration Center, and I used to attend there a lot of local and international conferences based here in UAE and Europe as well. I was also a former member of Dubai International Arbitration Center, London Court of International Arbitration, DIFC-LCIA. So I have advised several companies on matters relating to their dispute resolutions in UAE, including several arbitrations matter worth like 23 to 24 million US dollar disputes. So this is my little background regarding as a practicing commercial lawyer in UAE since 2008.
Shakeel sir, thank you so much for that wonderful background. And I have to say that whilst today we'll be looking at these principles under the UN Global Compact, you have so many diverse interests that you've just explained, and you have such a wealth of experience in the UAE that I will request you later on as well, whenever you have time, to conduct some more webinars on aspects relating to employment laws, especially UAE employment laws, and even the arbitration court system over there, because there are so many Pakistanis living in the UAE and there are so many who move there for job purposes. So I think that would be very beneficial to everybody to learn from your expertise and your brilliance. So Shakeel Saab, if we officially start now, when we talk about the relationship between businesses and human rights, there are just so many different angles over here that we have to look at, starting from the very Declaration of Human Rights. So do you want to take the audience through each of these points and just explain the background?
Yes, thank you very much, Sana. Basically, businesses versus human rights, it's really seems to be a new trend, or you may just say a new policy shift in the global thinking, because previously this was generally perceived at private and of course at public level that the basic responsibility for protecting the human right was for the governments. They always used to think that these are the only governments who are responsible for protecting human rights. But then the policy was changed, and in 2011, the United Nations passed a resolution under the name of United Nations Global Compact. So there were a lot of nation states of United Nations who signed that declaration. And according to that, some principles were distinctively clear to protect the human rights by the businesses, because I think this was really very important, and probably I would just like to say this was a turning point in the human history. If you see the history of the United Nations, even before the incorporation of United Nations back in 1945, there were a lot of wars like the First World War, the Second World War. There were a lot of sanguine conflicts between the human civilization, which ultimately ended on the financial and of course the lively losses of the human being. And after that, the world leaders, they gathered in New York, and they just formed they were just thinking to form an international platform where the international the entities can come forward to resolve their dispute at the political level in a very amicable manner. So first, that was really a great achievement of the formulation of the United Nations. And from the very beginning in 1948, the UN principles were in the 1948, the human the Universal Declaration of Human Rights were there. That was a very important treaty which was formulated by the United Nations to protect the basic fundamental rights of the humanity. So beginning from that, there were a lot of other treaties like human rights treaties relating to International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, International Covenant on economic, culture, and social rights of the people, and the children rights and the women rights, and some covenants relating to human trafficking as well. So this is really a brilliant history, I would like to say, for the humanity, if we just see the whole course of evolution of human history. But it actually reached at the climax, I would just like to say, in 2011. Then they formed 10 basic principles. They were formed by the United Nations, which were actually the guiding principles for the businesses throughout the world to enable them, even to help them to protect the human rights. So basically, these 10 principles are also sometimes called as CSR, corporate social responsibility. Sometimes they are called sustainability, UND sustainability, SDG, Sustainability Development Goals of United Nations for 2030. So, but mostly now at this point of time, they are called as ESG. E stands for environment, S stands for social, and G stands for governance. So, environment means there are three principles relating to environment. There are two principles relating to human rights. There are four principles relating to labor rights, and there is a one and tenth and the last principle is relating to governance, anti-bribery and anti-corruption. So these 10 principles were actually formulated through a lot of deliberations by international lawyers and of course the intelligentsia and the NGOs, and a lot of people actually involved in that kind of situation. So these were the 10 principles which have really shaped, and I'm just going to say that they are going to shape the history of human life. So this is a one perspective. The other perspective is that if you see why the United Nations thought about to bring human rights into their legal framework, what were the main reasons behind it? If you see from the historical perspective, we see that there were a lot of countries that actually initiated their trade activities in some specifically the developing countries, which ultimately culminated to their political dominance. And of course, they they exploited the developing countries in one way or the other way. But you can just understand that the basic was came from the trading and the businesses. So we can understand that how important the role of businesses may be in the formulation of the governments at a larger scale, and of course for the protection of human rights as well. And even if the governments can be formed by the businesses and the corporation, then we can easily understand that uh, 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 how important they can be to protect the individual rights of the people. So that was actually a history, and we are also aware at this point of time that there are several countries, uh, there are several multinational companies whose GDPs are larger than the GDPs of some individual countries. So you can imagine that how big they are so far as the finances or the economic prosperity of the world is concerned. And and the other thing is that initially it was a policy of the governments that the multinational companies were under the obligation to declare their human rights report on voluntarily basis. But then they realized, intelligentsia realized that this is not going to this is not going to make any difference. So they were not really declaring the annual reports so fairly, which could just fulfill the justice, which could fulfill the human rights and protection of the labor rights of human being as well. Then they started thinking to make new legislation where the international corporations or the MNCs should be under the legal framework, legally binding framework and convent, and of course, if they are going to violate for them, they should have to face some legal consequences as well. So for that perspective, these 10 principles came forward. And I would just like to share some information here that recently, like even 3, 4 days back, I was just going through some details that Germany has formed their own human rights due diligence report. And we are aware that the European Union had already made a law in March 2021, and that is going to be enforced early January 2022. And according to that, all the EU companies, European Union companies, which are working in different parts of the world, they will be under the obligations to produce the human rights due diligence report, which includes the labor rights as well. And of course, they have to get these reports from their supply chains. And this is really very important to understand for you and our audience as well, that most of the international companies are working, for example, in developing countries, like, for example, uh, iPhone, the Apple, they have their manufacturing units back in China or in the Bangladesh. So if you see the business structure, the whole structure of the businesses, there are sometimes thousands of supply chains are involved in one business. So this is not only the iPhone which we can just see at the end of the time. There are a lot of other supply chains, and especially now the world has become a global village. And in that context, actually, as per the new EU framework, the legislation, those EU companies will be under the obligations to make a proper human rights due diligence reports to contain the international crimes relating to human trafficking or the forced labor or the child labor, etc. So that is there, and this is the reason at this point of time, a lot of companies are talking very vociferously to make their human rights policies. So even the Germany has made their law, United States and California, they had made this law some time back. So the work is already going on. But from the next year, we think that this work is going to be further streamlined. And now, while I'm just talking and I'm just discussing in this seminar, like a few days back, the third draft of a legally binding treaty to protect the international human rights and the labor rights had already given by the legal departments of the United Nations Human Rights Council, which is going to be negotiated on 29th of October this year. And of course, that is going to be implemented very soon, and that will become a legally binding treaty for the almost all the countries of the United Nations to protect the human rights. So this is basically our historical background, that why the protection of human rights was considered very important by the governments, by the United Nations, the international platform to protect the human rights. So I hope it's a little bit clear.
Shakeel sir,
So
that was very brilliantly narrated. Thank you so much for that. Actually, this is going to be extremely informative because the average person obviously may not know the historical background of, the United Nations various declarations and treaties, and then the evolutionary, progress that it has made in terms of the impact. So, you're absolutely right in saying that people normally consider governments as being held accountable, but over here we are talking about corporations and businesses and how they ought to also, reflect these human rights principles. And then you very vividly explained the various different principles under the Global Compact, as well as the EU perspective. So, I'm very grateful to you for actually explaining all of that. And we've seen, everywhere in the world and even in Pakistan with certain companies and organizations, the significance of CSR or corporate social responsibility over the last couple of years, and how organizations globally are sort of taking a step forward in that direction, so sort of complying with a human rights rights framework. Although when we talk about Pakistan, which we're not going to at the moment, but I have to say there are many gaps over here in terms of the human rights structure. I mean, just yesterday there was a fire in a factory in Karachi, which again killed a certain number of employees. And again, this is because there weren't enough health and safety features that they were complying with. And again, there are just so many different implications of a lack of relationship between the way companies operate and their compliance with the human rights framework. That is much needed. So again, thank you so much for explaining all of these points, and we're just going to move on so that you can talk about all of these in more detail. So, Shakeel Sab, you mentioned the United Nations Global Compact, and you also spoke about these principles. Do you want to say anything more at this stage? Because I know that we will talk about this in more detail as we go ahead.
Yes, I think this United Nations Global Compact, it's an arm of the United Nations, and their principles have been ratified by the United Nations Human Rights Council as well. So they are basically the 10 principles, as I mentioned, relating to ESG. And currently there are approximately 12,000 companies which are a part of United Nations Global Compact. And they have actually made some wonderful plans. For example, the UNGC Ambition Accelerator or Ambition Accelerator. So basically, according to that, they are going to provide 6 months training to the different companies to assess and how they can formulate their policies practically, how they can overcome the challenges during the time of formulation of the principles uh, into their operations and the strategies and engagement with their stakeholders. So these are the very important. So I think we will discuss it in more detail when we will be discussing these 10 principles actually in the next slides.
Thank you so much for that, Shakeel sir. Now, again, you have spoken about this, but when we look at the UN Global Compact, again, you've already mentioned that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the starting point where it emerged from. Then we've got the International Labour Organization's Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. Obviously, one principle out of these focuses primarily on labor and related aspects, which is where this emerged from. And then you've got the Rio Declaration on Environment Development, United Nations Convention Against Corruption. So these are the primary origins of the UN Global Compact. If there's nothing else, do you want me to move on?
Yes, you can move on. Yes.
So, Shakeel sir, just one point before we actually delve into these individual principles. Now, normally there is a huge gap between the sort of principles or laws and the implementation or the enforcement of these principles, and especially with the United Nations treaties and regulations, we have seen over a period of time that there is just so much out there. There's so much written by the United Nations. There's so many treaties, but when it comes to the complying with them or the implementation, there can be gaps. So when we see the United Nations Global Compact, would you actually say that this has actually been successful in as far as businesses are concerned?
Yes, I think I'm very confident for that. As I mentioned, that based on these principles, the Germany has made its own law for its companies, and they are always under obligations to abide by these 10 principles of the United Nations. UK is already on the track, and as I mentioned, that this is going to be a legally binding treaty. And the one important thing I would just like to mention that. If you see the Expo 2020, okay, that's just going to happen in next month probably. The sustainability, there's one of the biggest employer over there regarding the sustainability. So you can understand how the UAE government and of course the international community is very concerned about the protection of human rights and the sustainable development goals of United Nations, which they made back in 2015, which actually started in 2000 under the name of MDGs, Millennium Development Goals, and they turned into the Sustainable Development Goals back in 2015. And now, although we had seen the pandemic last year, and due to this catastrophic issue, we and the international thinkers, they are understanding that the challenges to implement these 10 principles of United Nations have become even more severe. But even at the same time, the world is still on their way, and the progress is going on. The investors in most parts of the world, whenever they are just going to do business with any company, now their first question is that what is your human due diligence report? What is your ESG policy? What is your policy relating to environment, human rights, labor rights? What is your policy to anti-corruption, to contain the corruption and bribery in your organization? So I think I understand with you that there had always been a gap between the theoretical principles of the United Nations, of course, their implementation. So that was always there. Even we can see it even at the national levels as well. But I think, according to my own understanding, that even as of now, it's my understanding that the 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 world nation, they are still passing through the evolutionary stage. The Second World War, just like 60, 70 years before, and a human civilization is like 2000 years old. But my understanding is that we are still on our path of evolution. So if you see the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, which were formulated back in 2000, so if you see the reports which were delivered in 2015, so their outcomes or their achievements was really remarkable. Although it's always very easy to criticize, this was not achieved, this was not achieved, but what was achieved, that was really appraisable, that was commendable. So we should not always see the empty glass, half empty glass, but we should also see the half full glass as well. So I agree with you that yes, there had always been a gap between the uh, policies from the theoretical perspective and their practical implementation as well. But as I mentioned, that now the consumers, they are just asking from the companies what is their your human rights report, and even the other stakeholders like the investors, they're just asking for that. And and I think now this is just going to improve. And now specifically now we are living in a media time. It's a social media time. Every time the information is just traveling like the ampere, even faster than the speed which was given by few years back. So I understand that just the achievements are there, and the acquaintance, or at least the familiarity and the need for these principles is really increasing. And if you see, for example, you were just talking about Pakistan. ESG, environment, is one of the perspective, and even the governments in Pakistan has really taken some marvelous steps to improve the environmental standards in Pakistan. The million tree projects and etc. Again, there are a lot of things to criticize, but I do understand that is one aspect. And even though even globally, all the firms are just talking about the environment and how they can protect the environment. So I would just like to conclude my point on this specific question, that something is better than nothing. So at least we have broken the zero and we are moving forward.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Shakil Sab. I mean, there is a lot of information in what you've just said. And it's actually good to hear that, corporations across the globe are actually taking this seriously. And this is something that isn't just being confined to theory, it's actually being practiced. Now, the UN Global Compact Performance Report as well actually highlighted the fact that organizations that sort of performed in line with the 10 principles did significantly better on sustainability measures. So I think that you're absolutely right. I think there are some positive outcomes, and hopefully in the coming years we might actually see
If
more
you see, for
progress.
example, we all are aware that once we talk about the labor rights, there's one thing: human trafficking or the modern slavery. Australia has recently made their law. The United Kingdom had already on that way. And as you were mentioned, that the companies in UK, they are required to give their annual reports and the statements. So that is there. And yes, the things are moving forward slowly but gradually.
Thank you for that, Shakil Sab. Now, we have spoken so much about these principles, and on each and every slide, we're just going to talk in detail about each principle. So, if we can begin with human rights, if you want to actually talk about these two principles and just talk about the correlation between these and the operation of businesses.
Yes, sir. The first principle of this ESG, or the 10 principles approach of United Nations, it's the principle number one: businesses should support and respect the protection of internationally proclaimed human rights treaties like human rights. So as we just discussed at the Universal Declaration of United Nations back in 1948, this is also called International Bill of Rights, and subsequently it had also been incorporated in almost all the governments of the world regarding the fundamental right or the Bill of Rights for the people of that specific country. And under this law, there are several things which needs to be kept into the mind. So first of all, the most important thing regarding this principle number one is to what does it means? What does means the human rights protection? So the human rights protection is a very vast topic, and there are a lot of international treaties, as I mentioned, like International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, International Covenant on Economic, Cultural, and Social rights of the people. So they are always there. So they are relating to they always talk about the rights of the people, equal education, equal health facilities, and privacy, and equality before the law, and the labor principles and the ILO declaration relating to the reasonable working environment for the laborers, reasonable payment structures, their safety, their health. So these all principles have already been actually included in the Human Rights Treaty, and specifically the International Bill of Rights. So according to this first principle, the companies are under obligation to incorporate all these principles in their policy statement or their human rights statement. So what should be the principle, or what should be actually the practical application? That is another thing which we can just discuss with the passage of time on the other principles as well. But I would just like to concentrate over here. So the human rights policy should be enforced in a company across the board. So and as per the principle, all the departments like health and safety department, the HR department, the finance department, the sales department, the top level management, they should all sit together, and they are under obligations to estimate what is the human rights policy, either even if it's not written after these UN principles. So they should evaluate what are their policies, to what extent they are going to protect the rights of the laborers, either they are in connection with these international standards, either they are in connection with the nation state where they are working. For example, here in United Arab Emirates, the labor laws are very comprehensive in nature. They protect the lot of rights of the people. There were some likely shortcomings relating to the minimum salary of the people. So the government introduced WPS program, the wage protection system. And according to that wage protection system, the companies were under the obligations to pay the salaries to their employees through the exchange, UAE exchange and some other official exchange houses, to keep the record that they are paying it to their employees. And there were some also other achievements relating to health and safety standard and etc. They were incorporated into the labor law of United Arab Emirates of 1980. So that was an achievement, of course, and of course the other countries are also doing it at their level best. So these policies should be made by the management level. They should include normally the finance people, the HR people, and the role of legal expert is really very important, because the UN guiding principles mention that if there is some way that the national law is silent, that's not going to provide any details, then the international labor standards and the human rights standards or the UN global standards, they should be considered as a yardstick, and they should be enforced. And of course, for those principles, almost all the nation of the world, they are the signatory. If they are the signatory, they are under the obligations to abide by all those principles. So that is there, and the companies are just going to make their own policies, and they have to make their own policies, including all these human rights treaties and etc. So that is what is just going to be mentioned relating to human rights. And of course, as I mentioned, that no, it's a requirement of all the international investors, and the general principle should be that these policies, the human rights protection policies, should be enforced from strategy to operation to engagement with the stakeholders. So all these three stages should be taken into consideration. And as per the legal requirements, the companies, after making their human rights report, they should declare it publicly. They should discuss it even before formulation of these human rights reports or the human rights due diligence report. They have to take their stakeholders into confidence. They have to take their investors into confidence. They have to take the community at large into their confidence. And then they should make these policies and they should just report it publicly. So that is another thing which is required. And of course, the companies are doing it. And I hope there's still a long way to go, but the work is going on.
Thank you, Shakil Sir. I mean, you're absolutely right. We live in an age where the media, is conquering the world, and we need issues such as transparency, accountability. They're just becoming more and more vocal, and in light of that, in fact, all these organizations really do need to comply with human rights, and they need to make it publicly available as to how they're complying with this particular framework. And now you explain the background of the different treaties, the different conventions, and how businesses need to comply with each and every convention. You very excellently also explained the dimension or the application of this in the UAE, which is also something very important. I have actually seen the UAE employment laws, and you are right, they are extremely comprehensive. And I think that many countries, and especially UAE being one of them, have actually evolved over a period of time, sort of complying with these foreign treaties and foreign conventions, and they've improved their own internal sort of laws as well in accordance with these different treaties. So again, this is something that's extremely important, and it's something that I think that we will see in the coming years, that all organizations need to actually comply with the human rights framework. A point that you had actually mentioned earlier on is also very important for the sake of the audience, that you spoke about iPhone as an example, and you said that we only see the end product, but there is a whole background to the creation of
Supply
that
chain.
particular phone. Exactly, there's a chain over there. And then we go back to the origins and the different countries, and all the sort of the poor people, if you like, who are involved in in working on these particular products. So you spoke of iPhone, and there are just so many different organizations. If you look at the chocolates, for example, Cadbury and some of the other well-known brands, and then you look at the background, the small children who are involved in that process. So there are just so many issues in terms of human rights and labor exploitation, which we'll look at as well in a little while. And it has become very important for these, especially for the big corporations, to actually produce evidence, if you like, to show that they haven't exploited or carried out any human rights abuses in the process. Although again, as I mentioned previously, again that has been debated, but at least because of this. The role of the media and the transparency that exists now, I think that there is this level of pressure on corporations as well to comply, even if they didn't do so previously. So thank you, Shakil Saab, for this. And we're just going to move on to labor. And you did talk about labor. There's just so much
So I
under
think
this heading.
the one principle from human right is still left. I would just like to give a little introduction.
Yes, sure.
Yes, regarding make sure that they are not complicit in human rights abuses. So, I mean, again, this is really a very important task. I mean, the companies are not only required to protect the human rights at their own, but of course, they are also required to have a vigilant eye on the human rights abuses which might have been committed by their suppliers, by their supply chains. It's
Yeah.
not only to the extent of their strategies or to their operation, but
Yeah.
from the supply chain perspective. And even from that perspective, as I mentioned, that the new EU law is going to make it mandatory legal due diligence for the human rights for the different countries. Because, for example, most of these countries are working in the developing countries. And we are all aware that the political structure or the governance structures of those developing countries is really not substantialized. That's not really performing well. So these are the lacunas or the drawbacks which are sometimes potentially exploited by these companies. And of course, they bribe the government officials or the government authorities or the red tapeism of the bureaucracy. So these are the common issues in the developing countries. So according to the requirement of the 10 principles of the United Nations, and of course upcoming EU law, and of course law in Germany and some other European countries which is already existing, this will be the requirement to conduct a very thorough due diligence report, and it will really help to contain the menace of human trafficking. We are all aware that approximately at this point of time, approximately more than 40 million people are victims of human trafficking in this world. And it's a worth more than 150 billion US dollar business every year. So it's really increasing. And after the pandemic, if you see the recent reports from the ILO report 2021, it's really alarming. They're saying that due to the lack of working opportunities for the employees, the poverty has increased, and this poverty will further be exploited by may be exploited by these multinational companies or their agents. I'm not just going to blame the multinational companies, but as I mentioned, they are working with their supply chains. So these recruitment companies. So we are all aware that these recruitment companies sometimes working in different developing countries. So they are involved into unethical recruitment practices.
Yeah.
So they are actually exploiting the people. They are making money, and that is called debt bondage. So even according to some estimation and some authentic reports, they are charging sometime more than 200% interest for the loan they just give to those laborers who then become the international labor migrants. So just to cover all these issues and just to contain this human trafficking problem, so
Yeah.
this principle is saying that they are not complicit in human rights abuses. So they have to take care of their suppliers as well. They have to keep a very vigilant eye to avoid these human rights abuses. This was about principle number two.
So this is very informative. There's like what we've been talking about. There's just so much in the supply chain. There are just so many different hierarchies, so many different levels, and especially with this menace of human trafficking, I think it is extremely important for organizations to be wary and vigilant of what is happening at each level, so that ultimately they're not liable for what is happening by their suppliers. So again, thank you so much for that, Shakeel Saab. And now, looking at the labor principles, which again are extremely important. And yes, so if you just want to elaborate on each and every one of these principles.
Yes, yes. Basically, out of these 10 principles enumerated by United Nations, and most principles comes to protect the laborers, 4 out of 10. So it means that how important they are for the international community or for the international thinkers to protect the human rights and the labor rights. We are all aware that this is the only segment which had been very tremendously and sometime uh, it had already been exploited. And on 1st of May of every year, we are aware that the World International Labor Day is being celebrated. So we still understand that they are under great exploitation. So I had been a student of international labor migration in University of Oxford. So basically, I know actually how these laborers are exploited. So once it comes to the formulation of international labor migration policies, the different companies form their own labor migration policies. And when they form their labor migration policies, they principally take into consideration their national interest. And sometime under this so-called, you know, uh, slogan of the international interest, by knowingly or unknowingly, they are going to exploit the interest of the laborers. I'm just talking about the international labor migrants, even they are into more vulnerable position because they have to leave their countries. And now the issues and the problems being faced by international labor migrants, this is one of the most hot issue which is being faced by the international policy makers, and this is very hotly debated over there. So they're not in a position to get their civil rights or the social rights. So if you see, there are approximately, as per the World Bank report, 46 countries of the world which are the high income countries. or which are called the migrant receiving countries. So keeping that thing in mind, and according to ILO, at this point of time, more than 165 million people are the international labor migrants, and more than 35 million people recorded they are the international labor migrants who are working in GCC region, so which constitute more than 51% population of this whole region. And we are aware the labor force working in United Arab Emirates, more than 90% they are composed of international labor migrants.
Yes.
So, and even this factor of this globalization specifically, and this high-tech businesses are just going to take place, and now there's going to start another race of hunting international talent, and now the companies and the countries are just going to make their own policies, the labor migration policies, to get maximum talent to like for example the UAE, they just made some tremendous changes in their laws relating to the citizenship, and of course FDI laws and etc. And all other countries are just going to work on that side. And I remember a statement of the Commerce Minister of Singapore, and they are just saying that we are in hunt of the global talent in the next few decades. So the labor is not only the unskilled labor. Sometimes people think when we think about labor, we think unskilled labor, but there is a skillful labor and ultra high skilled labor. They are also there. So just to protect their interest, there should be some system which should protect them. So I think these UN 10 principles, they have enumerated these four principles to protect the interest of the international laborers. The principle number three is business should uphold the freedom of association and the effective recognition of the right to collective bargaining. And I'm sure most of the people are aware about the principle of freedom of association and collective bargaining. So this principle is actually introduced to protect the interest of not only the workers, but of course for the employers as well. Because in this point of time, this is a highly changing world. It's a high-tech world. We are living in a digitalized world. We are at the brink of artificial intelligence, blockchain, and fintech, and etc. and etc. So during this time, the disputes between the employer and the workers, they are of very complex nature. So that needs to be understood very precisely and very clearly. And sometimes the governments are not able to control everything through their regulatory framework. Of course, the regulatory framework is always important, but we do understand that according to keeping in this principle in mind, the freedom of association and of course the collective bargaining is important. Both employer and employee, they should come forward. They should agree on some basic terms and conditions of the business, working conditions, and any other problems, the dispute resolution mechanism, how it can be removed. And of course, even as per the requirement of this principle number three, the companies are under obligations. The companies are under obligation to provide maximum assistance to the companies and the laborers and their employees to make those policies in the best interest of both the parties to protect their rights. So that is really very important, and this is regarding principle number three. And if this principle is just going to be ignored, of course there may be more dispute between the employer and the employee, and if you were just going to contain their freedom, it can further deteriorate the progress of the companies. If the company have no happy employees, means they cannot have a better revenue reports or the financial reports. So for that perspective, the role of these freedom of association and collective bargaining is very principal. So the UN 10 guiding principle, they are always requiring that this principle should also be adhered very strictly. Any question on this one?
No, you're absolutely right. This is a very important point, and this is something that even when we see in Pakistan and when we look at different organizations where collective bargaining, unions, the freedom of association is extremely, extremely significant to hold the management accountable and to uphold the rights of the workers. And again, you're very right in explaining the difference between skilled and unskilled, workers and laborers, and that when we talk about labor, we're talking about practically everyone who's working. It isn't just
Absolutely.
limited to somebody who's unskilled. So no, thank you so much for that, Shakil. So please, you go ahead and explain the other principles, which again are also very important. We see a lot of infringements, I have to say, regarding these in Pakistan, but I think that that is something that we can debate at a later date. I won't stop you. Please go ahead.
Yes, the principle number four is related to the elimination of all forms of forced and compulsory labor. So the forced labor is it's another black spot on the beautiful face of the human rights, and most of the countries are, even you can say, they are blamed to be involved in this kind of practice. If you see recently, U.S. State Department, they imposed some sanctions on one of the province of China. So the reason was that they claimed that they were involved into some ethnic discrimination, some atrocities relating to some specific ethnic of some people, and they were using the forced labor. And of course, its resonance is being viewed and being listened across the globe. So this is the one factor. So they were just understanding that the forced labor is just being exploited. And it's not only there. A lot of other countries, there are reports like in Bangladesh, in India, in China, Pakistan, and some other countries of the Latin America, and of course,
Yeah.
North African region as well. This problem is there. So the basic essence of this principle is to eliminate the forced labor from its root and
Mhm.
just to discourage it. And the companies should have to make the policies very clearly to eliminate this menace from their policies. And even for this one, they are just required to work with their international partners, with their international, they have to work with the governments. Of course, they have to work with the NGOs, because sometimes they can just get data from the relevant NGOs. They are required to work with different, recruitment companies across the globe, and they have to understand that if there is any issue of the forced labor, so then this forced labor should be stopped and it should be provided with the alternative option, and of course with any incentive or privileges which must be under the local laws of some specific country, that should also be given. So this is really very important principles to contain this forced labor. And as I already mentioned, that the 60 to 70% forced labor is working in the labor markets, and 30% is into the commercial sex. So again, this is again a very huge problem which is being faced by the countries, and a lot of international advocates, they are always talking about that. So the UN principle number four is very categorical, that this forced labor should be eliminated at any cost. The companies should work with the governments, with their partners, with their stakeholders at each and every stage, and through, as I mentioned, human rights due diligence report, which not only includes the human rights, but of course the labor rights as well. So that should be surfaced, and the policies of the companies should be made publicly through all the possible communication channels to uh, to discourage this practice of forced and compulsory labor.
And then the other 2 points about the other two principles, the abolition of child labor and the elimination of discrimination in respect of employment and occupation. Again, these are very important aspects that
Yes,
are
of
part
course.
of
I
any
mean, for
labor.
example, the effective abolition of child labor. Again, child labor is a very, very important challenge which is being faced by most of the countries. And again, a black spot on the beautiful face of human rights. So this
Yeah.
should be encouraged. And of
Mhm.
course, and specifically the children, they have, every human being has some fundamental rights. But these children, they have some special fundamental rights
Yeah.
that needs to be dealt on a very priority basis because of their infancy, their childhood. If you're not just going to take care of them, so you are actually going to lose a great future potential of international world, and for the international companies which will be requiring the adult with specific uh, talent, with specific skills. So if these children are involved into the child labor at this very beginning stage, so it will really, it is just going to, it is going to have a very bad impact on their mentality, on their thinking, and they are not going to be educated, and they are going to be even mentally ill, health-wise, they will be ill, and that would be creating a problem for the society itself. But if you see even at the global level, the international labor migrant will be deprived from the highly skilled people. So this principle needs to be taken into consideration, and even this United Nations has also given some policy principles that what should be the age, like 14 years to 18 years, and they have categorized the different work like the soft work, the hard work, the hazardous work. So what should be the age limit, and if it is in any case it's required to be implemented, what should be the measures? And I think ILO is really working some way by this way or that way to keep eye on these kinds of human rights violations. So yes, the abolition of child labor is another very important uh, uh, target which is required by the UN 10 principle. And the sixth one is relating to the elimination of discrimination in respect of employment and occupation. I mean, this is not only relating to a gender discrimination basically. So discriminations can be within the same genders as well. So sometimes they are based, they sometimes the discrimination is based on the ethnicity, sometimes this discrimination is based on the nationality, on the language, on the color, on the creed, on the race, and of course the gender inequality is also there. So as per this principle, and keeping in mind the overall human rights as mentioned previously in my discussion, this is the requirement of the United Nations general principles to eradicate this problem. There should be no inequality. The women should be given the equal right as the men. And if you see the International Covenant on the Protection of the Rights of the Women, you will be surprised. They are given so equal rights with the men. So that's really commendable. That's really appreciable. So this is the real essence of this thing, that there should be no discrimination, no inequality, and of course we can discuss a lot even on this principle, that what should be the policy, how this policy can be incorporated, what are the real life challenges, how the media can play their role, how the civil society can play their role. That's another story which we can cover sometime in the later webinars relating to international covenant as well, a relevant international convention. So this is the again other important principle.
I think out of all these four principles, I mean, each one, is important in their own right. But this, of course, uh, is of paramount significance because of the nature of businesses and the way they operate. All of these points are extremely important to take into consideration and to ensure that at each stage, there isn't any sort of infringement. Although, having said that, again, the theory and practice are two completely different things. You talk about these covenants on gender equality, etc., which, but again, in practice, we keep seeing these gaps. But you're absolutely right. I think that there are all of these different mediums that play a part in bringing about this accountability, which includes the media and civil society, etc. But yes, I think that because we have some time constraints, I think that it's enough to give the audience a brief overview of the fact that this is the labor policy under the UN Global Compact. And just to move on, Shakeel Sahib, if you want to just briefly discuss this principle of anti-corruption.
Yes. Anti-corruption is principle number 10. Businesses should work against corruption in all its forms, including extortion and bribery. We are aware that this corruption is really creating a great problem, and it's a great hindrance in the progress of the companies at one hand, and at the same time this is a great instrument for uh, exploiting the people and just having human rights abuses and the labor rights abuses through this principle. So this bribery is, it's like a slow poison which kills the companies internally, and even sometimes the companies do not understand. So the anti-bribery, anti-corruption, there are some companies which are already working in UAE, and they are actually guiding the companies uh, to address this issue. And not even at the governmental level, we see that the countries which are involved in corrupt practices at the bureaucracy level, at the political level, or whatever level, so they are always behind progress. so far as the economic situation is concerned. But we are specifically talking about the companies. So the companies are under the obligations to take all the measures to eliminate the corrupt practices from their company. Why it's really important? If if there is a stakeholder, if there is an investor who wants to invest in a company, if he's not confident about the anti-corruption policy, like the ESG policy of the company, they won't be in a position to invest into this company. So if the corruption is there, then of course the employees of the company, they might be exploited. There is a big reason for them to get exploited. So if that is everything is just going to there, so it will stop the progress of the company to the next level. So it should be discouraged. And if you see the international pattern, and if this law was actually implemented, UN anti-corruption law back in 2005, December 2005. There are 70 to 73 principles or the articles of this law. If you read those articles very clearly, so there are some very preventive measures have been suggested, some how to cure this problem, and of course there is one issues relating to asset recovery. If you read the
Mhm.
law, you will be seeing asset recovery. So the developed countries, they are under obligations to, if they have enough evidence from the developing countries that these assets have been made through the exploitation or through the malpractices or through the corruption and bribery. So they are under obligations as per the law to take notice of that, and uh, just to sell those assets and send money back to the developing countries so it can be used for the beneficials, for the beneficiaries of the common people at large. So this is really very important principle, and we can just sometime have another seminar or webinar on this only anti-corruption convention of United Nations of 2005. But I think this is the 10th principle. This is really very important.
And Shakil sir, the all this issue of money laundering and banks, compliance departments and banks working to tackle that, so that would come into this category of tackling anti-corruption, because money laundering, of course, is a huge problem globally at the moment, and this is something that especially in the banking sector is working towards tackling.
Well, of course, entry money laundering. I mean, that's
Mhm.
under this one, and the UAE has very clear and strict principles to uh, fight with this menace of anti-money laundering, and they are just doing a lot of work on this one. And even a lot of companies, as recently they were required by the Ministry of Finance to go for GoML portal. So as per the GoML portal, most of the companies, designated companies, they were required to register for that GoML pattern, Go anti-money laundering, and then they are required to have their compliance officers and just to report it. And I think FATF, Financial Action Task Force, that's a part of that one, and a lot of work is going on. But I think that is also a part of this 10th principles of United Nations relating to anti-corruption. And we expect that if the world organizations at the public level, at the private sector level, they are just going to collaborate, which is the real essence and requirement of the United Nations, then I think we can have a better life. And of course, if you see the environment, there are three principles relating to environment, which we may discuss sometime later because of the scarcity of time today. So if we are just going to implement even 30% of all these 10 principles, the world is going to become like a paradise, I'm sure.
Very optimistic. Thank you, Shakil Sab, for that. And we'll just quickly touch on this. Again, this is also an important principle of the environment and how businesses need to take this into account. If you could just very quickly explain the importance of this to the
Yes, yes. The
audience.
principle number 7 is relating to business should support a precautionary approach to environmental challenges. Means this is not only the responsibility of the government to always take policies to protect the environment. The companies, the corporates, the MNCs, which are the economic giants, they have the resources, they have the money, so they are required to make their internal policies to protect the environments relating to these green gases and emissions of some gases and etc. They have to take some very strict measures. That is actually requirement of the principle number 7, and they should have to declare their environment policies publicly, as I mentioned, like the human rights policy and the labor rights, and of course, the anti-corruption. Environment is one of them. And now the world is very seriously thinking about that, and a lot of discussions are going on. And then there is an international summit on environment. Probably the UAE is trying to be the host. I'm sure they will be successful for that one. So environment is really very important one. And the principle number 8 is undertake initiative to promote greater environmental responsibility. Of course, this is not only the responsibility of the government or the civil societies, since these 10 principles are relating to the businesses. So the businesses are under obligations to take all those measures where they can discharge their responsibility to protect the environment before it's too late. And the principle number 9 is encourage the development and diffusion of environmentally friendly technologies. So this is not only encouraging for just grabbing them up, but of course making investment on them. And we do understand there are a lot of startups and tech companies. They are at this point of time are investing on sustainability and on the environment. This is again the principle number 9 is just to give the motivations to the international community and the business sectors. So this is a very important avenue which is waiting for your attention. So now, of course, while disclosing their policies and their annual statements, they have to describe everything about environment policies as well.
And when they talk about environmentally friendly technologies, can you give any example of what would be an environmentally friendly technology? What would be an example of that?
Basically, I mean, for example, we generally know first of all the plantation of the trees is really very important thing, and the emission of some hazardous and the dangerous gases, that is another thing. So everything which is normally which is against the life of the environment, that is environment hazard
Yeah.
issue, and that needs to be taken by the companies very carefully.
Thank you so much, Shakil Saab. And we could keep going on, but I think that we've reached. I think we've reached a stage where we can probably conclude on this excellent, I have to say, an absolutely excellent webinar. So, if you just want to summarize the key bullet points to the audience, what are your key
No,
conclusions?
but the key is that these UN global principles should be adopted, should be very strictly adhered to the policies of all the companies of the world universally. It's not relating to any specific countries, and these are not relating only to the multinational companies. Even the SMEs with 2 to 3 people, they are under obligations to adopt these UN 10 principles. And as per the law, they are under obligations to provide annual reports to the UNGC for their endeavors and efforts to protect human rights and environments and etc. and etc. And for the smooth running of businesses, as I mentioned, that this is not only going to protect the companies. If the companies are going to have well knitted ESG policies, they are not only going to make great business, they're not only going to have the financial revenues at a greater level, but at the same time, they're also going to support the civil society and the humanity at a larger scale to make progress and to make a better future for our generations to come.
Thank you so much, Shakil Saab. This was absolutely excellent. I'm just going to stop sharing the. Shakil Saab, I have to say this has been a very enlightening webinar. It was very informative for me as well, and I think that the good thing about these webinars is that apart from covering the legal aspects, we are looking at some historical points as well over here. So we looked at the United Nations and the evolutionary stages of that and the various different conventions, particularly this Global Compact. I have to be honest with you, before this particular webinar, I didn't even know, the details of the UN Global Compact, and it's again, it's very important for the audience to be able to know that, each year there are new conventions and new policies that are being, put in place, and that how important it is for organizations around the world to comply with them. So,
I would just like to add, this is so important that, for
yeah,
example, I was just reading a report that in India, for example, at all top ICS level exams, they are just putting a question, what are the SDGs 2030? What are the sustainable development goals of United Nations for 2030? That's really very important. So I would even just like to recommend so that these SDG 2030 and
yeah,
UN guiding principles, and they are just going to be incorporated, by the way, by various business schools of the world. They are incorporating business and human rights as a special subject in their MBA courses. So I would really recommend that even the countries should come forward and include these SDGs and the UN Global Compact principles in their courses as well to have a better
excellent.
generation. So,
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time, Shakeel Sab, and for an excellent webinar. If anybody has any questions, you can always leave them in the comment section, and Shakeel Sab will get back to you. For more information about us, please do visit our website, www.vla.com.pk. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you so much for being part of this webinar, Shakeel Sab.
thank you much. Thanks a lot. Thank you.